Retroid returns to the channel, but this time we're not talking about the Retroid Pocket Mini, which was part of a duo of new handhelds being launched by the Retroid crew. This time around, the Retroid Pocket 5 makes its introduction and is the successor to the very popular and loved Retroid Pocket 4 and 4 Pro, which brought tremendous power and value in a fairly compact package. The Retroid Pocket 5, much like the Mini, marks a shift in design language for Retroid handhelds, and with that shift comes a brand new 5.5-inch 16:9 OLED display, which marks the first time that the mainline Pocket devices have made this change. It's not the only first for a numbered Pocket release, since like its little brother, the Pocket Mini, the 5 is powered by Qualcomm's Snapdragon 865. And based on how well its miniature sibling performed with that chipset, there's a lot to be excited about here, especially for those looking for a larger and wider screen. As always, there's a lot to talk about, and so I invite you to join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we take our deep dive and determine whether we should strive for 5. As we always do, let's talk about the specs, price, and do a little unboxing of the Retroid Pocket 5, which, like every other Retroid release, ships in the almost iconic cardboard packaging, which really does let you know that something good is waiting inside. That's not all for the familiar sights, as we have the return of the iconic Retroid package, but this one has one very important change, with the RP5 writing on the box to let us know that something new is waiting inside. The Retroid Pocket 5 moves on from the smaller screens seen in the Retroid Pocket 3 and 4 line and introduces for the first time ever a 5.5-inch 16:9 aspect ratio AMOLED display at a resolution of 1920 by 1080 with a max 500 nits of brightness. Again, this is the first time that we've seen Retroid use this display and the first time that they've made the shift to AMOLED for their numbered product lineup. And just like its mini sibling, the Pocket 5 is powered by Qualcomm's Snapdragon 865, which marks the first time that we have a Snapdragon chipset in the numbered lineup, and with the Mini is part of the dynamic duo that utilizes this specific chipset. The Snapdragon 865 is an older chip in the mobile space, but has proven to be quite the performer on the Mini side, and it will be interesting to see how it translates over to the 5. The Snapdragon 865 is an 8-core chip that clocks up to 2.8 GHz with 4 Cortex-A77 cores and 4 Cortex-A55 cores. And most importantly, it features the Adreno 650 graphics, which has a tremendous amount of support and development around it. To keep things nice and simple, the Retroid Pocket 5 is available in only one configuration, with 8GB of LP DDR4X RAM and 128GB of UFS 3.1 storage. Unlike the Mini, the 5 has an additional 2GB of RAM, and it will be interesting to see how the extra RAM can be utilized on the upper end. We do have the option to expand storage with the microSD slot. On board, we've got Wi-Fi 6, Bluetooth 5.1, and a USB Type-C port that supports data, charging, and video out at 1080p 60. Unlike the Mini, the Retroid Pocket 5 is shipping with Android 13 out of the box, and this will open the door to apps that were not supported on the Mini with its older Android 10 ROM. I will make a note that since this is a pre-production unit, there are some bugs that Retroid is currently working on, and they are aware of, and hopefully these will be addressed in time for retail shipments. Inside the Retroid Pocket 5, we have a 5000 mAh battery, which is the same size as its predecessor, the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, but unsurprisingly larger than the one found on the Mini. I think based on what we've seen with the Mini, the efficiency of the Snapdragon 865 will allow battery performance to go further than it did on the Pocket 4 Pro, and we will definitely talk more about this in the usual battery section. Inside the box, we have a Retroid branded USB and Type-C cable, and there is no power adapter included, but the 5 does support 27-watt charging thanks to the Snapdragon chip. Beyond that, we have the typical user's manual that has become a mainstay for these Retroid devices and contains a limited amount of information with nothing else included here in the package. The 5 is available for ordering direct from the Retroid website and is priced at $219 US. The 5 is available in 4 different colors, including white, 16-bit, black, which is the color I received here, and an awesome Gamecube inspired color, which is actually the unit that I personally ordered. There's also some really cool accessories this time around for the 5, including these transparent back plates that I'm still very tempted to order and pair up with this black unit. I'd like to thank Retroid for sending me this review unit for evaluation, and as I always require, this video was not reviewed prior to publishing. It's now time to get really intimate and go close up with the Retroid Pocket 5 and take a tour around the device, starting out at the top right so we can check out the shoulder button and trigger. This looks quite familiar coming from the Retroid Pocket 4, which also had a very similar style and arrangement right down to the texturing of both the R1 and R2. The shoulder buttons here are just slightly larger, so these aren't the same exact buttons. The R1 is very quiet to press down on with just a light and subtle clickiness to them, and I like that these can be pressed down at any part of the button so that you can place your finger as you like, and not necessarily have to worry about being able to press down on it. The trigger has a nice and smooth motion with some resistance, but not as resistant as the ones found on the Retroid Pocket Mini. These are a nice size so that I can actually rest a good portion of my finger across the trigger, as well as having the texture so that it doesn't easily slip off. They are also slightly curved and feel really nice. I will be curious to see how I like these overall when gaming, especially for games that make heavy use of the triggers. Now going across the top, we have our power button, volume up and down buttons, and you can see where that back plate clearly separates from the front plate, as well as part of the exhaust vent for the active cooling. On the left side, it's the same story with the stacked shoulder button and trigger, and everything is finished identical to the ones on the right, including the quiet button presses for L1 and the nice and smooth movement for the L2 trigger. Now coming down to the left side, we have a great side view of something that is very new coming from the Pocket 4, with the built-in grips at the bottom that gives the Pocket 5 some curves. The pop-outs for the grips at the bottom also have a great texture to them, kinda like an Xbox Series controller, and clearly a very thoughtful design element. At the bottom of the 5, we have some of the usuals, including a micro SD slot with a protective door that is easy to open and close and does sit nicely flush with the handheld. Besides that, we have the 3.5mm headset port and the USB Type-C port for data, charging, and video out, as well as some more of the design element that conceals the part where the shell separates. Moving around to the right side, and we can see more of those curves for the grips. The back of the Pocket 5 is equally a clean design, with fairly minimal Retroid branding in the center, and then here's a full view of those textured grips, which should add to some comfort long term with the 5. And probably the most noticeable thing on the back is the massive intake vent for the active cooling, and we will definitely be peeking inside in the usual teardown portion in just a little bit. I really like the design of the vent here. I know the looks aren't entirely the most important thing when it comes to this aspect, but I appreciate the little details and touches. Finally, we have 4 visible screws which are holding the backplate in place. So let's go front side and talk about the controls, starting with the essentially iconic and well-known Retroid D-pad that at this point is a long-time staple of their devices. I appreciate that Retroid is going with a if it ain't broke, don't fix it mentality, and really their D-pad is one of the best in the space. Now it might be Vita inspired, but to me it has morphed into its own thing and is actually a better D-pad for it. It has a tremendous amount of movement off a very well-defined pivot that moves beautifully from side to side and top to bottom. The range of motion is so clearly defined and it's an absolute joy to use. This, as always, translates in-game, and something like my usual Marvel vs. Capcom 2 test, using the PlayStation 2 version, which is on screen, and pulling off combos while moving all over the place on screen proves to be absolutely no challenge and makes even the most rookie of players, like me, look far more professional. Now moving down, we have another staple of Retroid devices making a return, which is the Jinful branded analog sticks that provide a much improved range of movement compared to the Switch sticks that we've seen on other devices. And while they have greater movement, they aren't done at the expense of having the sticks sit too far above the face of the Pocket 5. If you're not familiar with the more recent Retroid sticks, these are also similar to the ones found on the Odin 2 and Odin 2 Mini from AYN. The cool thing is that the caps are all compatible with each other and interchangeable. For example, here I pulled off the caps from my Retroid Pocket Mini to show off on the Pocket 5. Now moving over to the right side, we have the face buttons in the Nintendo style BAYX configuration. And coming fresh from the Retroid Pocket Mini, I definitely prefer the ones here on the Pocket 5, and they are more in line with what I would expect to see from Retroid, and closer to what we've seen on handhelds like the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. They are still audible, but nowhere near as clacky as the ones found on the Mini, which is definitely a good thing. I also like the top of the buttons are a bit more rounded off compared to the Minis, which are just flat across. The buttons have a nice amount of travel and are slightly a bit more raised in comparison to the Pocket 4 Pro. We can see how the buttons sit when pressed down fully, which are a little bit above the face of the Pocket 5. And of course, below the face buttons, we have the other analog stick. In addition to all of this, we have the select and start buttons at the top, which use dome switches and are slightly audible. For whatever reason, my select button actually sounds a bit different than the start button, which is interesting. Finally, we have front-firing stereo speakers, which is a nice thing to see coming from the down-firing ones found on the Pocket 4 Pro. These get quite loud on the highest setting, and actually scale down to the lowest volume setting better than it did on the Mini. The sound separation is pretty solid, and their placement is very good, which doesn't get in the way and so your hands don't block them at all. Let's take a moment and listen in. Now, easily one of the biggest changes coming from the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro is the inclusion of the AMOLED display that makes its way into a numbered Retroid device for the first time ever. In fact, this is the first time we've seen Retroid use this specific 16:9 AMOLED display, and I think for many this is a welcome change, and like its miniature sibling, marks a shift for Retroid away from their prior IPS panels. This is a fairly high resolution panel, coming in at 1920 by 1080. Which at 5.5 inches gives it a very decent PPI of about 400, but is also a nice and bright display that maxes out at about 500 nits of brightness, which surprisingly does quite well outdoors here in Arizona on a nice and sunny day. The colors and contrast are excellent, and I found the viewing angles to be an improvement as well, especially when compared to the Pocket 4 Pro, which when held side by side with the Pocket 5, the backlighting of the IPS panel on the 4 Pro becomes very apparent. The improvements of this panel coming from the prior Retroid Pocket 4 Pro might be enough on its own to sway someone towards this device. I'll definitely talk a little more about this display, at least in comparison to some other devices. Now, since we have an AMOLED panel, one other thing that is actually really interesting to consider here is displaying 4:3 content, or just content that doesn't necessarily utilize the same aspect ratio as the Retroid Pocket 5. I personally ordered the Gamecube color for my Retroid Pocket 5, but I was legitimately interested in how the black unit would handle 4:3 or other aspect ratios, since we have the ability to give the illusion that the front of the unit can blend in with the screen, making it almost look like it's not actually a widescreen that's packed into the 5. I think this makes the black Retroid Pocket 5 stand out when considering your options. And in particular, if you were undecided between the Mini or 5, the Pocket 5 when displaying 4:3 content has a screen size of about 4.5 inches against the Mini's 3.7 inches, but we do have far more versatility with the Pocket 5 and its display. And while some of the changes and improvements for the Pocket 5 are more obvious than others, I believe that the subtle changes might be the ones worth talking about just as much, similar to what we saw going from the 3 Plus to the 4 Pro, which were very nice improvements, and the same can be said coming from the 4 to the 5. The all-glass front really does elevate the premium look of this device, and it's kind of wild to see where we are today with the Pocket 5 and where we were back with the very first Retroid Pocket. There's no doubt that Retroid has continued to improve and learn with each new release. I do like that the D-pad and face buttons do not have the glass etched right up against it, which we saw with the Mini, and this is both nice in terms of not having to worry about button presses against the glass, but also from a texture feel to give separation for the inputs. Nothing on the body shakes or rattles, the fit and finishing of everything here is very high-end, and really is a step up from their prior devices. This new design language that Retroid has adopted is a noticeable change and an improvement from all of their prior devices, which leads into the grips that Retroid has integrated into the body of the Pocket 5, much like its smaller sibling. If we take a look at the Pocket 4, we have those bump outs at the top of the device for the triggers, and so it makes a lot of sense that Retroid went back and just went the next step by incorporating the bump outs at the bottom to match the triggers at the top. This greatly improves the comfort for the Pocket 5, especially when you are holding it with a nice firm grip with your thumbs placed at the D-pad, which is on top, and the face buttons. This exact grip is a massive improvement in comfort over the Pocket 4 Pro, and you can see that I am holding the 4 Pro in the same exact way, but now on the 5 I have the benefit of those bump outs to give my fingers further support at the back. I also love that Retroid has added texture to these grips, which again from a tactile sensation really improves the experience. But of course, I shouldn't discredit the Pocket 4 Pro, since so many of those greatly improved elements that made its way into that device have now been transferred over to the 5, which includes the improved analog sticks, awesome D-pad, textured shoulder buttons and triggers, and so the Pocket 5 feels both like a natural progression that is Retroid in nature, but at the same time is also a departure for Retroid. In fact, the feel of the back plastic does very much remind me of my 4 Pro here, and so the similarities are there, and just like with the 4 Pro, I find that the black plastic that Retroid uses does a pretty good job of minimizing visible fingerprints. Now, one area I did have concerns with, and similar to the Pocket Mini, was the use of these shoulder triggers long term, and there's definitely a bit of fatigue there since these are a little bit more resistant, but also awkward to press fully down on when you're completely gripping the Pocket 5. So I think many, including myself, will find themselves adjusting the way they grip the handheld to accommodate for games that might be heavily dependent on those shoulder triggers, kind of like a racing game for example. But all in all, the Retroid Pocket 5 is a welcome improvement in terms of comfort, while not necessarily sacrificing much in terms of size. And speaking of size, let's go ahead and round up a few friends to make some comparisons with that might share some similar features, price points, or just as something worthwhile in general to compare against. Logically, with all this talk about the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, let's bring in my Skittles adorned 4 Pro first and compare the size of it against the 5 here, which as I mentioned is not much larger than the 4 Pro, with it only being slightly wider, but the 4 Pro is actually just slightly taller, and this is all taking into consideration that the Pocket 5 manages to pack a 5.5-inch display over the 4.7-inch display found on the 4 Pro, while coming in just barely heavier than the 4 Pro at 271 grams or 9.56 ounces against the 4 Pro, which weighs in at 268 grams or 9.45 ounces. This is truly impressive. It's also very similar in terms of thickness, while still retaining the same size D-pad and face buttons from the 4 Pro. Now it's very obvious to see that the 5 is making exceptional use of its available real estate, packing the 5.5-inch screen right to the edge, whereas the 4 Pro has much larger bezels all around. The display, as I mentioned earlier, is also quite the improvement here, and while it's difficult to fully convey on camera, there are just moments that I am absolutely blown away by the improvement coming from the 4 Pro. The 5's display naturally has much better contrast in person thanks to it being an AMOLED panel, and even simple things like viewing angles are greatly improved, which become much more obvious against the 4 Pro's IPS screen. And then we have Anbernic's RG556, which like the Retroid Pocket 5 has a 5.5-inch AMOLED display. And this is a handheld that I enjoy quite a bit with a great panel, despite a few of its weaknesses. The RG556 is a larger device when compared to the Retroid Pocket 5, which comes in being larger and wider than the 5, as well as having far larger and more pronounced grips at the bottom. The materials are definitely a bit nicer and feel more premium with the Pocket 5 as well, and for me personally, these Switch style sticks are such a disconnect on a larger device like the 556, which at times takes away from the handheld. The 556 is a cheaper device, coming in about $60 to $70 less than the Pocket 5 at retail, but as we will find out in a little bit, it is less powerful than the Pocket 5. Now speaking of power, how about the Odin 2 Mini, which manages to pack the power of the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 into a device that is probably closest in size to the Pocket 5 in terms of width and height. But the Odin 2 Mini is quite the chonker. It has a thickness of about 19.5mm, and it is a bit thicker than the Pocket 5, which has a thickness of about 15.5mm. What's interesting is that when you place both devices down, their profiles are almost identical. And so again, it shows that despite the Pocket 5 including the addition of built-in grips, it doesn't take away overall from the thickness of the device, which the Odin 2 Mini does not have any kind of real grips. It also happens to be heavier at a weight of 325 grams or about 11.5 ounces against the Pocket 5. The Odin 2 Mini has a 5-inch mini LED display that gets insanely bright, and while mini LED is quite the premium screen tech, for some the technology still can't quite get up there with a high quality AMOLED panel, and so some of the weaknesses inherent to mini LED become a no-go depending on how you feel about them. Again, it becomes very apparent just how well the Pocket 5 utilizes its available space, packing that 5.5-inch screen right to the edge. I know a lot of viewers were interested in seeing the Pocket 5 compared to the original Odin 2 as well, and so here we have the Odin 2, which naturally is a larger device, and the largest one that I'm actually going to be featuring here for comparisons. The Odin 2 does have a 6-inch display, so naturally it makes sense that it's a bit larger, and I will say that the Odin 2 is a very comfortable device. But interestingly, I do wish the analog sticks were a bit more inset, which Retroid did with the Pocket 5. In general, it's fun to compare both the Odin 2 devices here, but these are really in different performance and price points compared to the Pocket 5. But for many is the current endgame in terms of performance, and so it's worthwhile to take a moment and think about your own personal needs and use cases. And finally, just for fun, here is the Vita, a handheld that to me still retains absolutely top tier design elements, and it's truly amazing how Sony pulled this off so many years ago, and I'd love to see them make a dedicated handheld again. But at least we've got companies like AYN and Retroid bringing some really cool stuff to the market. Let's now take this all apart and tear down the Retroid Pocket 5 to learn more about what's going on inside the unit. These teardowns are useful so that we can get an idea of what's needed to replace certain components, like the face buttons and even how accessible the battery is to replace. I've got my iFixit kit ready to go, and we know from the product tour that this handheld has 4 Phillips screws on the back plate, which I'll go ahead and use a Phillips head size 00-bit that seems to fit it well. So quickly removing these 4 screws, and finally before we try to pop off that back cover, make sure to remove any micro SD card that you might have in your slot. Looking around the Pocket 5, like other handhelds, it's always a matter of finding the right spot to get some room to insert a tool or pick so that we can get some of that separation of the backplate from the front of the shell. So I'm going to go ahead and use my pick right at the inside of the L1 button, which lets me get that tool in there, but also to be able to give it some force at the seam between the front and back plates. This is a good spot to start to get those tabs separated across the top. With the top separated, we still don't quite have enough to get around the backplate since this is pretty secure. I will bring back the pick and insert it at the end of the R1 button, and with enough force and wiggle, we're able to get into the seam and separate the backplate all around the device. So let's take a closer look at the backplate, which is slightly flexible and not too surprising to help keep some of that weight down. The exhaust vent at the top does have a screen in place, but it is interesting that there isn't one for the intake vent, which would make a bit more sense to prevent debris and dust from getting in. I was curious to see if Retroid is utilizing every bit of space here in this very compact handheld, and it does look like the speakers are partially going into the grip area, which definitely shows that Retroid carefully thought about placement and how they could utilize all the space here. So let's take a peek at the back of the Retroid Pocket 5 without the back cover on, which shows just how clean this unit is on the inside. And while it's not something that we see every day, I can't help but appreciate that things are well organized, labeled, and nicely put together here. It really does show how far these devices have come in general. We clearly have things like the D-pad, face buttons, left and right analog sticks, speakers, battery, fan, rumble motor, and even the Wi-Fi antenna, all marked or visible from this point as well. Let's go a little bit closer and check out the 5000 mAh battery, and we will examine how accessible this battery is in just a moment. So first order of business, let's take a look at the face buttons, which will allow us to confirm some things like button swapping with other Retroid devices, as well as layout changes from the Nintendo to Xbox style. We don't need to change our current size bit, and we can actually continue to use the same 00-bit for the teardown, which I do appreciate. Now for what I'm seeing here, it looks like we don't need to touch the speakers to gain access to the face buttons, and for right now, let's go ahead and remove the protective plastic cover that is marked R, which is held into place with 3 screws. I will make a note that these screws are different than the ones holding the backplate together, which have a flat tip in comparison to the one I just removed. There are no hidden screws for this plastic piece, and the other 2 are visible by the right trigger, which can be popped off with just a little bit of force. Let's go ahead and quickly remove those 2 other screws, and with that we have access to that plastic piece and part of the trigger mechanism, which is actually built into this piece, similar to what we saw on the Retroid Pocket Mini. So with that removed, it does appear that we do need to remove the analog stick before gaining access to the daughter board and then to the buttons. There are 2 screws holding this piece into place. And of course, don't forget to pop off the analog stick cap as well, as disconnect the ribbon cable that is connected to the daughter board. Once that's all been done, the entirety of the analog stick will come right out, which lets us get a bit closer and take a moment to appreciate the improved range of movement with these sticks in comparison to some of the more commonly found Switch style sticks. And again, with that additional piece removed, I can still confirm that the speaker does not need to be removed to gain access to the daughter board. Let's go ahead and disconnect the 2 additional cables here, one for the R1 button and the other for the connection to the other board. We have just 2 more screws that need to be removed, and so let's go ahead and do that quickly. And just like that, the daughter board has been freed from the Pocket 5. And now the moment of truth. We can take a look at the membrane and face buttons, which just like the Retroid Pocket Mini are glued down to the membrane. Now from what I understand, Retroid started doing it this way so that the entirety of the face buttons can easily be removed and swapped with another set, which for example like the ones that they sell on their website in different colors. The glue reminds me of some Elmer's school glue, and I will carefully separate the A button so that we can confirm the button swap here. Let's go ahead and place down the A button in the position where B used to be, so we can go for an Xbox style layout, and as I suspected, these will need to be modified by clipping one of the pegs so that the A can sit properly inside the shell, very much reminiscent of other Retroid devices. Now I just so happen to have a Retroid Pocket 4 Pro disassembled off camera, and removed the set of skills buttons that I had on that device, which actually came from a Retroid Pocket 2S, and then were modified to fit the 4 Pro. So let's see how they fare here on the Retroid Pocket 5. And yeah, these fit pretty well, with just a B button that needs a little bit more modification so that it can fit perfectly in here. Oh, and for fun, I threw my set from the Retroid Pocket 5 into the 4 Pro, and they likewise will work with just minor modifications. So now that we confirmed button swapping, let's continue on with our teardown. And like I mentioned before, we don't need to remove the speaker here to gain access to the daughterboard, but I'll go ahead and remove the 2 screws, which will let us take a quick and closer look at it. This is a decently sized speaker, and again, Retroid is making full use of the space here to fit a speaker this size in. It's now time to see how we can gain access to the battery, in case a replacement is needed to be done in the future. We don't actually need to remove any of the daughterboards to gain access to the battery. Instead, we need to move toward the center of the device and begin by removing the fan assembly, which is held into place with 3 screws. With the screws removed, the fan will pop out pretty easily. Now just be careful though, since it is crossed with the wire for the vibration motor, so just take care when disconnecting the cable for the fan. Now we don't quite have access to that cable to disconnect the battery, so we will need to continue and remove this protective plastic piece from the device. We have 4 additional screws to remove here, and one of those were actually hidden away under the fan, and so the fan definitely needs to be removed in order to gain access to that hidden screw. With all the screws out, we can now lift the plastic piece up. Just make sure to disconnect the cable for the vibration motor from the mainboard before lifting it up. The details are really pretty impressive internally with these nice touches that present a very organized device internally. So we're still not quite at the point that we can gain access to the battery connector, which means we will have to remove the heatsink next from the device. Like we've seen on other Retroid devices, we have the R sticker, which is for warranty purposes, except in the United States this is actually not enforceable, and so I'll just go ahead and remove it, which will give us access to one of the 3 screws that you will need to remove in order to free the heatsink from the Pocket 5. And with all 3 removed, we can now gently lift up the heatsink, and don't worry too much here since the Pocket 5 is using thermal pads here, and we can peek at the underside, which also reveals that copper lining on the bottom. And what do you know, we now have formal markings from Retroid's parent company, More Chip Technologies, with their branding on the casing for the Snapdragon chipset. Now I can't recall if this is the first time that we've seen this, but definitely let me know in the comments if it is. And finally, with all of that, we now have access to that tiny connector coming from the battery that powers the main board here, and this would represent the steps needed to replace the battery fully if you wanted to swap it or service it. And so I think I've satisfied everything I wanted to do with this teardown, and now it's time to get into some quick benchmarks. And while the Retroid Pocket 5 shares the same Snapdragon 865 as the Retroid Pocket Mini, I still wanted to examine numbers here since the 5 does have Android 13, and I'm curious to see how the different performance profiles compare against each other, as well as put the Retroid Pocket 5 against the 4 Pro and Anbernic's RG556 in terms of synthetic numbers. Much like we saw with the Mini, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of differences between the performance presets going from the standard to high performance, at least in the Geekbench 6 numbers, with pretty similar numbers across the board. The story really remains the same when we switch over to the 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme benchmark, going from standard to high performance, which at least for the synthetic GPU numbers is nearly identical across the board. Finally, for the Antutu benchmark, which gives us a good sense overall of the performance here, we are seeing a similar story with the weakest overall performance coming from the standard performance as expected, but really the gains between the 3 profiles is not very significant, and does show overall that for most applications, standard performance will probably be the way to go. Now taking the best numbers from the Retroid Pocket 5, and let's bring in the best numbers I achieved with the 4 Pro, which has the Dimensity 1100. And this chipset does outperform the Snapdragon 865, at least in terms of synthetic numbers for the multi-core score, but does fall behind on the single-core score. And finally, the Anbernic RG556, which has the Unisoc T820, and falls behind both the D1100 and Snapdragon 865, with lower numbers on both the multi-core and single-core scores. And then shifting over to the 3D Mark benchmark, taking the best score from the Pocket 5, which just slightly outperforms the D1100 in the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, which came in at 1,272. And finally the TA20, which really falls behind both the D1100 and the Snapdragon 865 with just a score of 568. And now let's bring in those Antutu numbers, with the Pocket 5's best numbers for me coming from the performance preset with an overall score of 795,797, against the Pocket 4 Pro's D1100, which scored lower with an overall score of 717,499, and finally the TA20 in the RG556, yet again falling way behind the other two, with an overall score of 505,775. Now, like I did with the Mini, I checked out the thermal stability using the 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme stress test, and first using the standard performance preset with the fan turned off, the Pocket 5 had a stability percentage of 89.5%, with a best loop score of 1,281 and a lowest loop score of 1,146. But then running this same test again with the fan turned on, the Pocket 5 did fare a lot better with a stability of 99.4%, and a much more consistent loop scores of 1,285 for the best and 1,277 for the lowest. So it's now time to finally get into some gaming, and as much as I really enjoyed Android gaming on the Retroid Pocket Mini, I think for most Android games will be a better fit on the Retroid Pocket 5 thanks to its beautiful widescreen display, which will definitely scale better for most Android games. I think this device has the real potential to become one of the best ways to play the library of games that are available on the Play Store, and there's actually quite a number of great games, which I have covered in numerous videos on the channel, which as always I definitely recommend checking out. But first, let's start out with the popular free-to-play staples, like Diablo Immortal, which has been on screen, and based on what we saw with the Mini, it's not much of a surprise that it performs just as well here on the Retroid Pocket 5, using the highest settings that can be set in this game across the board, with a target frame rate of 60, using the high performance option with the Retroid Pocket 5. Basically, we have enough overhead here to adjust settings and preferences as needed, based on priority towards battery life or visual fidelity. Now, a game I didn't feature last time was Call of Duty Warzone, which I was not able to get to launch on the Retroid Pocket Mini, and I think that's due to it being on Android 10. But finally, I get to test this game out here on the Retroid Pocket 5, since we are on Android 13, and the game does launch properly, and so it's really exciting to see this game on this device, since I think many will be playing Warzone on here, which is just an absolute blast to play, and it feels great here on the Pocket 5. I have the game set to a high FPS target, with high settings for the resolution, upscaling quality, and shadow quality. The only setting here that is on low is the visual quality option, since I don't have the ability to go higher than that. But the gameplay is great, feels fast and fluid, and I see this being a favorite for many on this device specifically. Wuthering Waves is another game returning from my mini review video, but this time around we can truly appreciate the gorgeous AMOLED display here with Moonlight. I have the game set to use low settings with the high resolution and a 60 frames per second target. Now these are my preferences, which prioritizes that higher frame rate and higher resolution. But again, we have room here to adjust settings to the way that you prefer to game, and here I have the Pocket 5 set to the standard preset with the Smart Fan option, and performance is mostly on target for that 60 frames per second, again with some room to adjust settings as needed. And as always, it's impossible not to talk about some Fortnite, which I didn't feature over on the Mini, but I think here on the 5 it will be a very popular game to play, since the combination of the great large display, lightweight, and ergonomics will yet again make the Retroid Pocket 5 an excellent way to play Fortnite, which can be downloaded from the Epic Games Store off the Epic Games website. The game does very well here, as well with a 60 frames per second target using the 75% resolution scale and high texture quality, and outside of the normal initial drop, the game stays locked to that 60 frames per second target. And while you've got the Epic Games Store app installed, you might as well download some Fall Guys from there, since it actually received a port to Android recently and is another great game to check out for the Retroid Pocket 5. It's a game that one of my daughters and I enjoy playing since it's just good silly fun. The game is set to the highest settings available here, and it's another one that looks really nice with the Retroid Pocket 5. Now, I always love to feature great premium experiences that are available on the Play Store, and Halls of Torment is a very recent release for the Play Store that received an excellent port to the platform. I am pretty bummed that it doesn't have cloud save support just yet, since I've actually made some good progress on a different device I've been enjoying, but Halls of Torment on the Retroid Pocket 5 is a treat as well, and of course has no issues running here even when things get a bit hectic. It's well worth the one-time purchase and it comes highly recommended, which we really do need to show support for so that we can continue to get great games like this on the Play Store. And speaking of another great game that has made its way to the Play Store, I have Carry On here, which I couldn't believe when it got announced for the Play Store, and continues the stream of great indie content slowly making its way over to the Google Play Store. I really do think that Android is a great platform for a lot of these indie games, especially with all the fantastic retro handle options that we have nowadays with full controller support. So let's now switch on over to the world of emulation. And while performance-wise the Retroid Pocket 5 will have no issues handling games from the 5th generation and earlier, I talked about the versatility of having this specific black unit with the AMOLED panel, and I really enjoy the way that it handles different aspect ratios that kind of just disappear with the black glass front. And so I'll start this section off by showing off games in the 4:3 aspect ratio, just to give a sense of how things look here. And so let's start out with the 6th generation of consoles, and specifically the Nintendo Gamecube with the Dolphin emulator straight from the Play Store. And no better game to show off the AMOLED display than some Beautiful Joe with its gorgeous art style, and in particular, the game looks phenomenal with some upscaling, and I have Beautiful Joe here set to use 3 times the native resolution of the Gamecube, which is the 1080p setting, and so ideally this is where we will want to max out with Gamecube considering the 1920 by 1080 panel that we have here. But I decided to keep things at the 4:3 aspect ratio for this game, and it's just absolutely stunning and amazing how well this game cleans up and looks here. If I were to take away the frame counter, the game really does give off the illusion that we are working with a 4:3 aspect ratio display. And I always enjoy featuring the GameCube version of Soul Calibur 2, since this was the start of the franchise making its jump to multiple platforms, and each platform had their own unique character, with the GameCube version having a special appearance by Link. For Soul Calibur 2, I have the widescreen hacks turned on, and so now we get a sense of what we could do with widescreen hacks on the Retroid Pocket 5 and how some of these games will look. I really do like having the versatility of the Retroid Pocket 5, and I think many will feel the same way. Soul Calibur, like Beautiful Joe, is set to use 3 times the native resolution of the GameCube, and I think in general GameCube will be quite solid on this device, with harder to run games maybe needing to go with a native or 2 times upscale. The same can be said for the Nintendo Wii with Dolphin, which also performed quite well here with the Retroid Pocket 5. The lighter games like Muramasa, for example, ran really well with that 3 times native resolution of the Wii and completely transforms games like Muramasa, which just look very sharp and crisp at the higher resolution, combined with the great colors and contrast of the Pocket 5's display. Definitely don't sleep on the Wii library, which does have a lot of great games that can be set to use the classic controller. Sonic Colors is a perfect example of a game that has classic controller support that works very well at the same 3x native resolution, and given how vibrant and colorful this game is, it looks just absolutely beautiful on this display. And again, much like Muramasa, really comes through with the crispy and clean visuals. Now, something that we weren't able to check out on the Retroid Pocket Mini was some Wii U emulation, which is now possible on Android thanks to the availability of Cemu for Android. It's important to note that Cemu is still very early on in development, and so it does have issues with compatibility, stability, and of course performance. But I've had fun starting to dive into some of the Wii U library and look at games that would not be playable on Android without these Wii U versions, and you've probably noticed that DuckTales Remastered is one of those games that work quite well with the Cemu emulator, which is running here at the native 1080p resolution for the game, and is one of the better performing and stable games with Cemu. Another game that I've always enjoyed on Wii U and other Nintendo platforms is the Fast Racing series, which comes to us from Shinin, and this studio is responsible for some shmups that I really love over on the Nintendo DS and 3DS. The Fast Racing series is a ton of fun, and is a futuristic racing game that has some similarities to F-Zero, but it does its own thing like the color changing phases, which gives it a nice little twist. I'm surprised by how well Fast Racing runs on here with Cemu, and while it's not perfect, performance is better than expected. But I did make use of the graphic pack for this game and turned the resolution down to 960 by 540, which still looks nice here and lets the game run at or close to 60 frames per second. Since Cemu is still early in development, just consider this a bonus platform that will work better than expected depending on the game. And speaking of bonus platforms, it's almost impossible for me to not discuss some Nintendo Switch emulation, which is something I always love tinkering with here on the channel, and have done it now on quite a number of different devices. I did a full-blown showcase of Nintendo Switch games with the Retroid Pocket Mini that I thought worked well with that device despite the 4:3 aspect ratio. And so for the most part, the games featured there should work quite well here with the Retroid Pocket 5. But we now have Android 13 on the Retroid Pocket 5, which means we have access to essentially all of the available builds of the various Switch emulators and all of the forks. I specifically used the latest version of Sudachi that is available directly from their website, and I tested quite a number of games. The easier and more compatible titles like Celeste, Golf Story, A Short Hike, Guilty Gear XX Accent Core, and Alien Hominid HD all work really well with Sudachi at a minimum of the native resolution using docked mode. There were games that performed better than I expected, and one notable game for me was Ori and the Blind Forest, which I have running here at the native resolution using docked mode, which means that on this device it's running better than it would be on a Switch in handheld mode. Ori is a great game to show off thanks to its visuals, which are further accentuated by the AMOLED display here. I always like to say that Switch emulation is a bonus for a device like this, but given the vast size of the Switch library and range, you will find that a lot works quite well here. And so, I always say give it a shot and see what you can get away with. Let's now jump to the Sony side and check out some PlayStation Portable emulation first with PPSSPP, which I think is not going to be much of a surprise that PSP does well here with the Snapdragon 865. It's also a perfect fit since the aspect ratios match up, and so if PSP is an important consideration, the Retroid Pocket 5 will be the better choice over something like the Retroid Pocket Mini when choosing between those two devices specifically. But what I didn't expect was just how much I would enjoy PSP gaming with the Retroid Pocket 5 and its fantastic screen, which just looks absolutely gorgeous here. I started with some lighter games like Flow, which is just super vibrant on this panel and has no issues running at 4 times the native resolution of the PSP, which is a perfect match for this panel since 4 times native resolution is the equivalent of the Retroid Pocket's 1920 by 1080 display resolution. Not only do we have the upscaling, but I went ahead and enabled the 60 frames per second cheat, and performance here is very smooth. Now taking it up a bit, here's some Wipeout Pure, which is a game I've been missing featuring, and so it's a fun one to revisit, especially since the visuals are gorgeous. And just like Flow, I have this game set to use 4 times native resolution with a 60 frames per second cheat, and again, performance is just solid. And really in general, I love being able to target that 1080p upscale to the Pocket 5's display. Finally, for one more PSP game, I had to of course feature God of War Chains of Olympus, since it's a good baseline for performance, and again, God of War is doing well at 4 times the native resolution of the PSP, which just looks very clean and upscales nicely to this panel, and again drives home just how awesome of an experience PSP is on the Retroid Pocket 5, and for sure PSP fans have a lot to be excited about here. And of course, we can't forget about the PlayStation 2, which is one of my personal favorite home consoles that just has a tremendous library of games to choose from. I did a massive PlayStation 2 emulation showcase with 50 games using the Retroid Pocket Mini, and I definitely recommend giving it a watch if you're curious about additional performance for games, since things should be quite similar here with the Retroid Pocket 5. So let's start out with a game I've featured on the channel before, but it's a hidden gem that I love giving attention to. And not many realize that the shmup series Thunder Force received an exclusive sequel on the PlayStation 2, which is a very fun game that looks amazing, and in particular with the Retroid Pocket 5. Since I do have Thunder Force 6 set to use 5 times the native resolution of the PlayStation 2, which of course is absolutely unnecessary, but it's always fun to see what we can get away with on the lighter end. And how about some RPG love with Rogue Galaxy, which comes to us from the RPG Masters at level 5, and they are responsible for so many great games in the genre. Rogue Galaxy has the fantastic visuals that level 5 was known for during the PlayStation 2 era, as seen in other games like Dragon Quest VIII. Rogue Galaxy is a bit more of a demanding game to run, and so for this one I am set to use 2 times the native resolution of the PlayStation 2, and performance is holding steady, and it looks very sharp with this upscaling. And yes, we always have to feature God of War 2, which makes a return here, and if you've seen my mini review or PS2 showcase, you already know that God of War 2 has no issues with the Snapdragon 865, and the same performance can be seen with the Retroid Pocket 5, which handles 2 times the native resolution of the PlayStation 2, mostly staying at 60 frames per second using the NTSC version. Now I wanted to feature some racing games, since longtime viewers of the channel know that I love my racing games, and first I have some Midnight Club 3 Dub Edition, running at 3 times native resolution, which is just awesome to see for a game like Midnight Club 3 that allows the gorgeous nighttime visuals to come through. And for another racing game, how about some Need for Speed Most Wanted, which has been heavily requested and is a more difficult game to run with PlayStation 2 emulation, but with the Retroid Pocket 5 we are able to get away with 2 times the native resolution, mostly staying near or at that 60 frames per second target. And finally, one last game returning from the mini review video, which is always a difficult game to emulate, but with the Retroid Pocket 5 we thankfully have enough power on hand here to be able to enjoy Shadow of the Colossus, which I do have set to use the native resolution of the PlayStation 2, despite the game probably being able to get away with something in between the native and 2x native resolution. And of course I had to save the best for last, since lately I've been having so much fun exploring Winlator, which lets us run Windows games on Android, and I was really blown away by the performance, even with the Snapdragon 865, which I made a full video on using the Retroid Pocket Mini, and I expect the results from there to translate over to the Retroid Pocket 5. For example, here I have Tomb Raider 2013, which I featured in that video, and this one still just blows me away, that we can have a PS3 and Xbox 360 era game running with the Snapdragon 865. The performance is quite good for Tomb Raider, which I have set to use a 1280 by 720 resolution, which is slightly higher than what I demonstrated over on the Mini, and performance is up there, staying well above 30 frames per second, and at times reaching as much as 60 frames per second target. I think in general Winlator has come a long way, and you will be surprised by its capabilities and the doors that it can open. Definitely check out my video on the topic to get a sense of how things fare, and also how to set it up. Now for one last use case, I think the Retroid Pocket 5 will make a great option for many looking for a streaming device, since it has all the right inputs, a larger screen, as well as great weight and comfort, which will make this an ideal choice for many when it comes to game streaming from a PC, PS5, Xbox console, or even cloud gaming as well. I've been doing this test a lot lately on the channel using Moonlight with Sunshine, streaming from my local PC, which is actually hardwired to my network. I have Ori and the Will of the Wisps making a return as my demo game, which just so happens to be a great showcase of the display because of the contrast and darker scenes. I was very impressed by Moonlight on this device, which I have set to use a 1080p resolution, targeting 60 frames per second, using the auto setting for the decoder, as well as favoring the lowest latency, and I have a pretty strong network at home, so my network latency was very low, which can be seen on screen. But what really impressed me was the remarkably low decoding times, which hovered around 5 to 6 milliseconds and is among some of the lowest I've personally ever tested and seen on a device. I think it's clear that the Retroid Pocket 5 has the capabilities to be a very strong streaming device for many. Okay, so as always, after all of this gaming, how do things fare in terms of battery life with the Retroid Pocket 5? And since this is a pre-production unit, Retroid is aware of issues with the current build of Android 13. And specifically, there are quite a few issues going on with the battery optimization. And so with that in mind, it's important to understand that Retroid is aware of the issue, and their plan is to have it resolved before units ship. As always, I'm presenting my findings, but I expect that this section in particular will change moving forward for retail units. So right off the bat, let's go with my lighter test, which now uses Mega Man X2 for the Super Nintendo, who I have Nate from the RH Discord to thank for the recommendation, and I actually started to use this with my iPlay 60 Mini Turbo review, and this will be the game of choice for lighter battery tests moving forward. Using the standard performance preset with the fan turned off at 50% brightness and Wi-Fi and Bluetooth turned off, as well as the battery saver turned on, and we got about 13 hours of on-screen time. Interestingly, the battery life is worse than what I experienced with the Retroid Pocket Mini, which does have a smaller 4000 mAh battery. Now I think there are some things happening here, including the fact that the performance presets are adjusted a bit differently, as well as battery optimizations that Retroid claims they are still working on. And of course, for my higher end battery test, we do see something similar happening here with God of War 2, which is using the standard performance preset, again with the quiet fan option, at 50% volume, 50% brightness, with the Wi-Fi Bluetooth still turned off, and the Retroid Pocket 5 managed about 3.5 hours of on-screen time, again trailing the Retroid Pocket Mini slightly despite the Mini having the smaller battery. The standby time is also clearly suffering from the battery optimizations that Retroid mentions is an issue currently. I left my Pocket 5 overnight at 31%, and when I got started for my day, about 7 to 8 hours later, it was at 2% and almost dead. The same goes for charging the device, which currently does not support the 27-watt fast charging capabilities of the chipset, as well as having some issues getting that initial charge when the device is fully dead at 0%. And for right now, I've had to do a trickle charge from my PC's USB port, and then swap over to an actual power block. I will definitely be keeping an eye out for the fixes for the battery issues since these have been pretty annoying to deal with. And I will pin a comment as well as add a note to my description area if they've been resolved by Retroid in the future. Which kinda leads nicely into the discussion about Android 13, and Retroid will be shipping the Retroid Pocket 5 with Android 13, unlike the Retroid Pocket Mini, which shipped with Android 10, but we'll be receiving it at some point in the future as an update. I think it's nice to have Android 13 support with the Pocket 5 since this device with its display can make better use of some of the doors that open thanks to having a newer build of Android. And I do hope that Retroid can address the remaining issues on their list with Android 13, which I've put up on screen again. Now, Android 13 is not the only thing that Retroid is currently cooking right now, and they've been working on a new launcher, which is pretty significant, since this is really the first time it's been updated fully since the earlier days of Retroid, and they've been previewing the new launcher, and so it will be interesting to see how things fare with that as well, which will be a nice option for those that prefer jumping into a launcher instead of seeing Android. It's not the most crucial thing since there are some really good front ends available for Android, but it's always nice having options, and I commend Retroid for at least putting the effort into their own software. And once some of the known software issues are ironed out, the hardware itself is very much an appealing proposition, especially at its price point, which manages to pack a 5.5-inch AMOLED display, a Snapdragon chipset, improved build quality and materials, comfort, and refinements that in many ways make this the complete package. If you've never owned a Retroid device, the Pocket 5 is very easy to jump into, and there's not a whole lot around this price point that can compete outside of its predecessor, which is slightly cheaper and will probably be even cheaper secondhand, but I do think there's a lot here to make the jump from the 4 Pro worthwhile. And despite what the numbers might say, the Snapdragon 865 is an overachiever in that real-world performance, does better than the Dimensity 1100. The black unit I have on hand here is interesting as well, since if you're truly undecided between the Mini and the Pocket 5, I think the Pocket 5 is the best of all worlds, despite how much I enjoy the Pocket Mini personally, since it can accommodate various aspect ratios with the AMOLED display that blurs lines that gives off an awesome illusion with the black RP5 model in particular. The dynamic duo of the Mini and Pocket 5 is an awesome step forward for Retroid, and I look forward to continuing to tinker with the Pocket 5, and there's no doubt that it will be making a return to the channel. But until then, as always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.